Thank you very much for coming along today. I'm going to do a presentation today about some of the tailoring work I do. My name's Steve Ricks. I do tailoring stuff. I produce costumes, mainly the doctor's costumes and whatever. And you may have seen me in my 10 coat that I made. That was one of the first things that I did back in about 2007 or so. And you may also have heard of the blogs that I've got where I've written about quite a lot of the doctor's costumes, and I've got all different blog feeds for each different doctor. And we've done some stuff with Louise Page, talking about all the stuff that was done for the 10th Doctor. Now, when I was young, I used to love the Muppet Show. That was the one thing that I used to watch quite a lot. And I always wanted to be able to have my own Muppets. So what I did was I used to persuade my mum to let me use her old hand crank Singer sewing machine, and I'd get bits of fur and felt and stuff, and I used to make my own Muppets. And that was when I was about maybe 8 or 9. So at that age I was getting quite sort of used to using a sewing machine, and getting used to using a sewing machine at that age, it's really sort of given me a real good grounding to just sort of at least know how to use the thing. And that there is that's a Singer 27K. It was made in 1908 in Glasgow, and this is the machine that I now use to do all of my sewing on. I don't use any of these modern fangled electric things. I can't see them lasting really. I rather use something that sort of type of period, and it's another reason why I do that. I'll touch on a little bit later on, because it dates from the sort of Edwardian period. 1908 is sort of right in the middle of the sort of Edwardian period, and I always see that a lot of the costumes for the Doctor are Edwardian in styling. So I quite like the fact that I'm using an Edwardian machine to make these Edwardian costumes. Now, this costume that you can see here, that's obviously the 6th Doctor coat, and that's actually something that I've got and I've kept ever since. Now this here is my very first effort at making the Colin Baker costume, because I used to watch Colin Baker when he was the Doctor, and I was fascinated by his coat. I looked at his coat, thought, I wonder how that coat is made. And the thing that interested me was the way the lapels go all the way down to the hem, because everyone's jacket, normally you've got like the roll and you've got like where it buttons up. I'd never seen a coat that had the roll line going all the way down to the hem, and that really fascinated me. So I looked at the coat and I realized that you could see the shape of every single piece of the coat, because every piece of the coat is a different color. So I just left school and I was at college, and I had my old school blazer, and I took it apart and I used that as my basic pattern to be able to create this coat. And all I did was I literally went around fabric stores, and I found bits of fabric that were like the right type of colour and texture, whatever, and I just literally cut things out freehand, and that's what I came up with. The most expensive fabric I got was the tartan, because I wanted to find a tartan that was just red and black, that didn't have any white in it or green or any yellow, any sort of those colours I didn't want to have in there. So I had to go up to Regent Street to get that. So that was a coat I made. That was about 1984, 85. And I've kept it ever since. It's one thing that I've always wanted to hang on to, because I just love that coat. But at the time, the problem was that you didn't have any decent photographic reference. This is basically all I had to work from. There was a particular cover of Doctor Who magazine that came out at the time. There was a really nice colour picture on the front. Because Doctor Who magazine in those days, it was all black and white. There would be a colour cover, maybe a colour poster in the middle, and the back page would be like probably an advert. But there was that one cover picture in particular. That was one that I used as a lot of reference. And the annuals that came out in the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s, they often would have a nice photographic cover, but inside it would all be just comic strips, photographs of the Saturn rockets or something like that. They didn't seem to have the license to put pictures inside the annuals. So that's basically all I used as reference, that and watching the television, because we didn't have DVDs or videos in those days. So it was literally just down to watching it on TV. And sometimes I'd watch an episode and the Doctor would walk away from camera and I'd go, oh my God, there's something on the back that I hadn't spotted before, and I want to try to get that right. So that's all I was doing. I was doing a lot of it from sort of memory. getting the fabrics, it was a very different thing in those days because around the sort of 80s, almost every high street in the UK had some form of fabric shop because people were still making their own clothes. They were getting patterns and making their own clothes. Whereas what we've got now is we've got the internet where you can search the world for all these fabrics, which means that there seems to be fewer actual fabric shops around. So what I did at the time was I literally scoured every single fabric shop in my local area, in my neighbouring towns, until I found all of the fabrics that I needed for that one coat. But then between about 86, when I did this, and now, I really didn't do anything else. It was only really when David Tennant came along and he was the doctor and I saw his coat that I thought, I want that coat. That's a coat that I really want. And a friend at work said, oh, I've seen that you can buy these coats that David Tennant wore, you can get them on eBay. So I bought one of these coats off eBay and was a little bit disappointed because it just didn't really do it for me. And I thought I could do better than that. So I persuaded my mum to lend me her old sewing machine again, and I got some fabric and I had a go. I took the one that I bought from China apart and used that as my pattern in the same way I'd done with the school blazer. And I made myself a coat. It wasn't great. I never did actually take any pictures of it because when it was finished, it was one of those things that I wasn't really happy. It was the first thing I'd done in like 15 years. I'd never been on a sewing machine in 15 years. But then I produced that one. That's my Mark II, where I'd found a better fabric, which is the Malabar fabric that I think everyone's sort of heard of that I use now. And that was the first one where I think I'd actually produced something that I actually wanted to wear and actually sort of be seen around in. And about 3 or 4 versions later, I then produced that version, which is the one I think a lot of people have seen. But I wanted to be able to do things a little bit better. I wanted to be able to do a bit more interesting work, and I was getting people asking me, oh, could you sort of make me a coat? Could you sort of make me a Tennant coat? And I had people even coming to me out of the blue asking, could I make them like a sort of Peter Davison coat? So needing to be able to do better work, I did actually look to go to college and get a bit of training and a bit of background on what I should be doing to actually do tailoring better. And if you want to do a better quality version of tailoring, I can really strongly recommend, if you can find yourself a local college that's got like an evening class in doing dressmaking or pattern cutting, really would recommend doing that, because I've learned so much literally in the first term that I was there. I used to just get bits of calico and cut up patterns, and then I'd adapt things and then cut up another bit of calico, and even though calico is cheap, I was then using so much calico, by the time I got a pattern that I was happy with, I'd spent as much as I did on the coat that I needed to make. But after I did a term at college, I found that I was able to cut a pattern, get it pretty right, make a couple of minor alterations, then be spot on, then ready to go straight through to make a finished garment. So going to college has always been a real godsend. And it was there that I learned how to do sort of hand tailoring, proper sort of bespoke hand tailoring, because I'd started out using, there was this particular book. This is a really good book actually. It explains how to do tailoring, but it does it on different levels all at the same time. If you look here, this particular page here, it's talking about how to tailor the front of a jacket. And on the far left-hand side, it's got what they call a custom method, which is like the full bespoke hand tailoring, everything's hand stitched. There's one in the sort of middle there that is like a bit of hand tailoring, a bit of fusible that makes it a bit quicker. And then over on the right-hand side, there's one which is all fusible interfacing. It's the quickest way of doing it. And this book tells you how to make a jacket, from tailoring the front, to doing the sleeves, doing the collar, doing the hem. And it tells you go through how to make one jacket, but tells you how to do it in 3 different levels of how you can actually do it. So if you find there's a particular bit, when it comes to hand tailoring, that's a bit tricky, like doing a collar, you can maybe just do it the easier way. Or if you come to a bit that, oh, I think I can be a little bit more adventurous, you can then use the hand tailoring way. So it was a really handy book that I used to sort of slowly get myself up the ladder from doing quite cheap tailoring where it was all fusible to doing proper hand tailoring where I'm using horsehair interface and linen tape and all that type of stuff. But it's a really good book for that. But the other book that I found at the time as well is what's called a cutter's guide. I started speaking to my college tutor. She started to tell me about how tailoring was done and how tailoring used to be done, and told me about cutter's guides. And it's basically a Bible to tell a tailor how to do his job. It's a book which has got patterns, how to draw the patterns up from scratch, how to assemble a jacket and how to tailor it. And this is a cover of a book that dates from 1890. And in it, it's got various pattern guides. That's one for a frock coat. It's a bit distracting because there's like a sleeve pattern superimposed across the bottom. I've just coloured it up so you can see the shapes of the pattern there. But it tells you, if I just come over to the screen, it tells you how to draw it up from scratch. It starts here at this point 0, and it tells you to draw a line from 0 down to a 1, which is probably down here, and then measure down various levels. So if you've measured a person, you measure how far they are from the nape of the neck to the underarm level. It tells you, then put that measurement into here. So if you're doing someone who's a chest 36 or someone who's a chest 44, you can adjust it accordingly. So you draw down to here, it tells you to measure across to the underarm position, and then between this point here and this point here will be half the chest measurement. Yeah? And across here would be the waist measurement, and you've got these little allowances for little darts so that it fits. But these are cutter's guides based on stuff from British tailoring in the 1890s. And I've got a couple of other 3-volume sets. Got one from 1936 and another one from the 1950s. The 1950s one is quite interesting because it's got a load of stuff on doing military coats and doing RAF coats. And looking through it, there is actually like a pattern for what you would describe as a Captain Jack coat. And it's got how to draw it up from scratch. So there's all these old musty books, and if you just start drawing them up, you can bring all these patterns back to life. It's absolutely amazing. Now, as I said, when you look at the early doctors, their style of dress is all Edwardian. It's all wing collars, it's all frock coats, it's all morning coats. So what I've done is I've gone back to these original patterns, these original sort of 1890, 1936 patterns, because although there are commercially available patterns out there which are sort of vintage or period in style, they're not necessarily cut correctly. And sometimes they tell you instructions on how to put the coat together, which aren't really the best ways to do it. And what I found when I was looking at some of the doctor's costumes, particularly the Colin Baker costume, I found that there's particular seams where you can see how they've been put together and in what order they've been put together. And that makes an enormous difference to how a coat will drape and fit once it's made. Because if you just throw something together and don't put it together in the right order, sometimes things won't hang right. Makes an enormous difference. So moving on to the third Doctor, John Pertwee. Now, John Pertwee had a little bit more of an interest in the costumes, I think, than the first 2 Doctors. And from what I gather, it was his original idea to wear the Inverness cape, which it's rumoured was originally his father's Inverness cape. But his clothes, a lot of them were tailored on Savile Row. They weren't just necessarily off the peg out of Angel's costumiers. And one of his costumes was sold at auction a few years ago. This is the purple double-breasted smoking jacket from Planet of the Daleks. And you can see there it's got the original label inside there, and Anthony J. Hewitt, Savile Row tailor, made for John Pertwee. And it's the way a Savile Row suit or jacket is cut. When you look at how they're done, it's very much in the Doctor's style. It's a lot more sort of fitted at the waist, so you get that sort of flaring like on a Peter Davison coat. If you imagine, everyone is looking for that sort of hourglass shape of the skirt. But it's all down to how they sort of cut things just a little bit slimmer, a little bit tighter. And it is down to country, because if you look at suits that are made in Italy, they're made a lot looser in fit. If you think of in the 1980s, the TV series Miami Vice, the suits that were all rolled up to the elbow, those suits were a lot looser. They're more of like they're more of a sort of Italy style, and that has an effect on how obviously the coat looks. And there's another little subtlety. If you ever see a pair of trousers where they've got a pleated front, if a suit is made in the UK, the pleats will go outwards. Italian tailors fold the pleats inwards. So there's these tiny little subtleties between how each country will actually make a garment. And if you go to the Far East and get a suit made in Hong Kong or something like that, they tend to, because it's the Far East, if you think of like sort of Japanese puzzle boxes, and they're always trying to miniaturize things and put little sort of hidden boxes where you have to slide panels to be able to get into something. The Oriental tailors, they tend to put little sort of secret pockets inside the belt line, or they tend to put all these tiny little pockets inside the jacket. I don't know if anyone's bought like a suit from like sort of Barron's or something like that, or if you bought a suit from Honest Dragon, it'll have like inside pockets and have all these other little pockets inside. And that's something that the Far East tailors tend to do, whereas a Savile Row tailor will keep it just down to what's the minimum that's needed, just a couple of inside pockets, maybe one down on the inside as well. So the way things are tailored, it is down to country. There are certain things which are very typical of the UK, of America, of Europe, or even of the Far East. And then we move on to the 4th, 5th and 6th Doctor, and we're then starting to get the frock coats. Now, frock coats. This was a garment which tended to be worn by the gentry around the sort of late Victorian period into the Edwardian period. And it has a few very distinctive trademarks about it that you can look for. It's always got a seam that goes around the waistline. You can see on the Peter Davison coat there, it goes right from the button to the right of his pocket. And then in that waistline seam, you've got a pocket set. And that then, below it, you've then got a flared skirt, which gives it that shape to it. And all three of those coats, although they all do look very different in their appearance, there's so many things about them which are absolutely in common. And even the later sort of City of Death style coat that Tom Baker wore, there's so many things about it which are the same. So it's finding that right pattern and finding the way it's cut will make an enormous difference to what you're doing. Now this is a pattern that's out of the that 1890s pattern guide that I showed you earlier, and on the left-hand side you've got the basic what's called a block for a jacket, because what you do is you drop a basic fitting block, which is the minimum needed to be able to create the shape that will fit around your client or yourself or whoever you're making it for. And then you make adjustments and style line changes to be able to produce the finished jacket that you need. And on the right hand side you've got an illustration there of, as it's described I think in the book, as the sort of latest fashions that are just coming out. Because around the time that this book was published was when the sort of lounge jacket started to come out. Because in the UK all of the members of Parliament were always sort of the landed gentry who sort of represented their local area in Parliament. They would always wear frock coats. You'd always see members of Parliament wearing their frock coat. But there was a particular member of Parliament who decided, I've decided I represent the people. And he went into Parliament wearing what was known as a lounge jacket, what you think of now as like a suit jacket. And he was the one who sort of broke the mold. I can't remember the guy's name. He broke the mold of wearing frock coats, and then the lounge jacket became more popular, and that's how the sort of frock coat sort of faded away. But this basic pattern here is what I've used to produce a lot of jackets that I do. And in the same way that I pointed out those other frock coats, the Tom Baker, Peter Davison and Colin Baker frock coats, they all look different, but they're all from the same basic pattern. And what I want to show you is that, if you could pop that back on for me. What I've got here, that's the Series 5 Donegal that Matt Smith wore. We've got the Series 6 Shetland Tweed. Thank you. And here I've got the, is there a chance you could lock off and just... Got an extra mannequin there.
The perfect mannequin.
Yeah. So, there we go. Now, all three of these jackets have all been cut from that one basic block. And all I've done is done the necessary minor changes. Now, if you were here a couple of hours back when we did the Dressing as the Doctor panel, I was talking very briefly about how this suit was cut and about how, if we just turn this a bit, raise your arm, we've got this seam down here, which I needed to be able to move further towards the front because of the limitation on fabric. And that's basically, if you look over there, you can see there's like a little dart on the right-hand side that's a little sort of fish-shaped dart that goes up to the underside of the arm. That I just literally just, on my pattern, just sort of moved it over. And below that, I then just carry on the lines down to create a lower seam. And this jacket as well, you've got a seam down here and a seam down there. So you've got, in the middle of that, you've got that middle panel created on the jacket. And then all that's been done, the only difference between the slightly looser looking Series 5 Donegal and the slightly more fitted looking Shetland Tweed is that the diagonal line you might be able to see for the roll line of the lapel, I just dropped it down. So it's just lower down here to do like a 2-button closure, or it's higher up for like the 3-button closure. That is the only change I made. So the basic pattern on both of these jackets is identical apart from how the lapel and collar is cut. And that is what's just called a style line. Because this could come out to here to be like really wide, like some 1970s looking jacket, or this could be cut back to look like a more like 1960s sort of mod style fashion. Or the lapel could go up to a point to be more like a sort of like a reefer jacket, or we could just draw the line over to make like a double-breasted. So it's just, you take this one basic pattern block and you just change it and adapt it as you need. And from that, you can then draw your patterns up. So the thing that you need to do, if you want to be able to do your own tailoring, is to be able to create your own blocks. So I drew them up from that book, created my patterns from there, and I've been able to do quite a lot of work with just that one block. So I know that block fits me. I haven't got to do anything else to redraw it from scratch. Sure, question?
What do you use to, what papers do you recommend? I know in Savile Row they do almost a cardboard thick manila type paper. What do you use?
Right, yeah. I draw my patterns up on just dot and cross paper. There's like a big rolls of quite thin paper you can get, and it's got a 1-inch grid of alternate dots and crosses, so that when you're drawing it up and you draw the vertical line for the back seam, and you need to draw a perfectly horizontal line for the underarm or the waist, you've got these dots to draw on. And whilst you're working that up, you work it in just that dot and cross paper. And then what I do is I trace it off. You can get just sort of tissue paper. I trace it off. When you trace it off for your from your block to create pattern pieces, then you add your seam allowance. Because this block is drawn without any seam allowance. Because you might want to put a wider seam allowance, say at the bottom for the hem, or you need just like a small amount along the back, or you might want to have a much larger seam allowance on the front for the for where the collar or the lapel is. But then once you know that you've got it absolutely perfect and it's fitting and it's all been, you sort of signed it off, then you could maybe cut it out in that sort of thicker card, because then that just makes it more durable. But your drawn up block and pattern that's the master. When you trace it off onto tissue paper and add your seam allowance, that is really just a translation across to get your garment. Because once I've done that and I've cut out the fabric, that the tissue paper, I don't care if that gets damaged. It's my block that I'm worried about, that original drawn block. Okay, is that nice? Yeah?
I just wanted to add to what you're saying there. I've had some good luck with, once my block is done and I know it fits, I transfer it to that brown paper that you can get at like bush paper for shipping. Like the brown paper you wrap packages and ship. And that's, if you can get it to roll flat, that makes what you're doing. Once it's flat, there, it's really hard to cut.
Yeah, yeah. That is the best way to do it. So you've got your, once you've sort of locked it off and you know that you've got a pattern which is your perfect fit, then yeah, that is basically what I do as well.
That's just really easy to find it.
Yeah.
Whenever now I just go down to like CVS or Walgreens and you can find it anywhere, so it's not like something you have to special order online or anything like that.
Okay.
Sorry. The dots and crosses stuff, where do you get that?
I've got a supplier that I just get my tailoring stuff from. It's quite easy to get hold of if you've got the right type of supplier. I forget if it's got a particular name. I mean, if you contact whoever you get your suppliers from and just mention dot and cross paper, they can normally get it for you.
In the US, I think it's called pattern paper.
They just call it pattern paper. Okay.
Pattern paper is almost a dot and cross, and you can find it online.
And you can also just get as well, because I get mine like a big roll. I get like a 100-meter roll at a time. But you can get just little packs, just in like a sort of craft shop where it's just like a grid. Just anything that you can use to that's got a guideline just to help just to speed you up. So, after I'd done a few things for various people, someone contacted me out of the blue and said, "Oh, I've got the original Colin Baker costume. Would you be interested in seeing it?" And I thought, yeah. I mean, you know, let's sort of go back a bit. You know, I'd made this. I'd loved this costume, and I made this back in '84. And I'd kept it all that time. So yeah, I'd quite like to see the original. So I had the chance to see the original, and when I saw the first time I saw that coat, I was completely blown away. It looks like a complete mess of colour. And a real cobbled together costume, but the original of that coat is so beautifully made. I cannot describe how well that coat is made. And the guys who owned it allowed me to use it to take patterns and create my blocks and do everything I needed to do to be able to make a replica. And what you can see here, if you can just look very closely, that's some of the thin tissue paper that we were talking about earlier. And what I did was I laid it over the original coat. You can just see the coat coming through underneath. And I just literally drew with a felt pen to get the shapes. So I had to then lay the coat out in various ways to be able to sort of make the underarm panel go nice and flat and whatever. And at the end of it, I then produced my block, which frankly is the most complicated pattern block I've ever drawn up. There is so much going on that pattern. If I just come to the screen, I'll just point out a couple of things. You can see the pocket, and then this line goes down here, which is the sort of peachy panel, and then this line from here going down this way, and then that way is this way, and that way is the little sort of triangular panels that go down the front there. And then this line here is the line of the edge of the tartan. And then up here things get a little bit complicated, because normally on a jacket you'd have like a chest dart to give a little bit of shape around the upper body area. If you don't have that, you'll tend to find your garment will gape a bit across the chest. When you have like a lapel or something, you might find it will sort of sit out here. So you need to basically, you've got a bit sticking out like that, you need to lose that. You need to pinch it out, so you end up with a dart. Once you've got a dart, you can then rotate that around to any point. If you think of it like a bus dart, you know, you can move the dart around wherever you want. And what we've got is, there's what would be like a bust point, and we've got a dart going up here, which is on the chest part of the coat, and then on the underside of the lapel there's a dart that goes this way, which is technically the same dart as that one, just rotated around. And when I made my coat, I didn't know about that dart, so my coat doesn't sit quite right. But it was, as soon as I saw that in the original coat, I thought, oh, that's how that works. That's how you make that coat fit. So it was seeing things like that that made me suddenly realise this coat is so fantastically made. And the guy that made it was actually a guy called Ron Davies. Now, he was the best pattern cutter at Angels, the theatrical costume makers. And he's even written textbooks about making costume. And he's written, if you go out there online and search, you can find there's a textbook about making period frock coats and costumes dated 1600 to 1900. And he's got all these, like I showed you on that other pattern block, he's got all those blocks in there as well. So this guy was the best in the business at making costume.
What was the name again?
Ron I. Davies. In fact, I did speak briefly earlier to June Hudson, and we were talking about various things. I mentioned this coat, and I mentioned him. She goes, "Oh yes, I remember Ron. He was the best in the business." So his reputation within the UK sort of theatre costume making he was sort of second to none. So now, after I draw my block, if you look at, you can just see, you can't really see the detail, but you can see the picture on the left-hand side there. You can see the sort of double lines of the seam allowances. Because what I do, just as a shorthand to myself, I trace off the finished net size of each panel, and then I'll draw the seam allowance on top of that. Because, as I said before, sometimes I might want a different width of seam allowance at different places. So what I do is I'll draw them on the pattern, so that when I come to assemble, I just look at the back of the pattern piece and think, oh yeah, that's where I wanted to do a 1 inch, as opposed to sort of like a sort of 3/4 inch seam allowance. And then from that, I made myself a couple of calico tests. And if you're going to make a costume, I would always strongly recommend doing a calico test, even if it's just made out of some cheap cotton that you got from a fabric store. Don't ever try to skip that stage.
It's usually called making a muslin.
Yeah, making a muslin. Yeah, that's what you call it in the US. Because it's so exciting to make your pattern and then go zooming straight off and start cutting up your fabric. Because you've already bought your fabric, you might as well just get on with it. Don't. A number of times you just end up just going back over things, recutting stuff out, and you just wasted all your fabric. So even though I've got myself to a good point in making costumes, I always made a muslin on that. And I just made it's just the bare basics. It's just enough to check that the chest is fitting, that the drape of the skirt is working. And you can see I've only just put one sleeve on. I haven't bothered to put both sleeves on, just to make sure that things were working properly. I wanted to make sure I made this coat right. And there's so much about how it's put together, which is so sort of unique to how this coat's made. I decided to do a version of the coat in a single colour, so I'm not worrying about the 14 fabrics that are involved. I'm worrying about the construction of the coat. What you can see on screen there, that's actually the original purple one I did. I then was asked to make a couple of coats for a civil partnership wedding, and I thought, well, if you can make 2, why not make 3? So I made myself one to keep. So this was my first serious attempt at actually assembling the coat. And you can see how across the back there we've got those little triangular panels that I was telling you about. You can just see the seams down there for that. And it's got this rather distinctive curved line of the back. And there was one particular part about how the coat was assembled which I could never quite fathom, because there was a seam down here where, when it had been pressed, instead of all the seam allowances being pressed nice and flat, it had been pressed sort of with all the seam allowances going in one way. I thought, well, that's not right. Well, why would you do that? And I realised what the tailor had done. He had attached the lining on the inside to that seam, and this was a way of hiding it. And it creates a structure down the back of the coat so that the lining is now only hanging between here and about here, rather than hanging from here right round to the front. And what it does is it creates a bit more stabilisation of the way that the back split hangs. It makes it drape nicely. You can see there, it just hangs straight. Because sometimes if you've got the weight of the lining, so the lining can be light, but it can still have a pull on the coat on the inside. So sometimes when you put a lining in, you always got to slightly make your lining ever so slightly bigger than the coat rather than slightly smaller, because it'll just, if you've got anything that just pulls a little bit tight, you end up with it hanging up like that. So it just needs a tiny amount, and there's nothing you can do. You've got to go back and recut your lining. And I don't want to be doing that. Hopefully this won't collapse. So that was my first attempt at assembling the coat. The next thing was getting all of the fabrics together. Wow, where to start? So we've got 14 fabrics on this coat, and I was able to find a company up in the north of England that does short-run fabric dyeing, and there are 6 solid coloured pieces of fabric on the coat. If we just move this out the way. Go. If I turn around like that. You've got the 6 different solid coloured fabrics in there, and we were able to get lab dye tests done to be able to check that we were getting the right colour until we got those 6 colours totally sorted out. I'd found a place that would do the tartan. That wasn't going to be a problem. I then had the slight issue of what do we do about the collar and this irritating back panel, because I needed so small amounts. The only way to do that was going to be to get it hand woven. And then the last thing was the lining. And the lining on the original coat, you can see it there. Everyone thinks that it's what's called a watermarked silk, or or a sort of moire silk. It's not. The actual pattern is woven into the fabric. What you're seeing there is not iridescent effect, it's actually the design of the fabric. And although I had like a supplier in the UK that does any lining I want, I showed them this and they said, yeah, we can do anything you want except that one. And then I'd run out of the lining that goes into the tenant coat, and I didn't want to go back from a self-stripe to a plain lining. So I'd got some contacts together, and I found a mill in China. I dealt directly with a mill in China and got them to weave an exact match to the original double self-stripe lining that's in the tenant coat. And they said, oh, we can do anything you want now. If we've delivered this fabric to you, any other needs you've got, come to us, we can do it. So I sent them a photograph of the fabric. Yeah, we can do anything you want except that one. So I was starting to think this is never going to happen. If I can't get this lining done, I'm not going to do the coat. So I had a little bit of a rethink. Can I borrow your tie? I was looking at the fabric, and there's all very complicated pattern. There's like all different sort of bits of silk coming through, and I thought, well, where else is there a fabric that has a complicated design, that's woven out of silk, that I could do? And I thought a tie. If you think of a tie, it's got a really complicated. There's like yarns coming through from the back, quite a complicated design. So I did some searching around, and I found myself a silk weaver in the UK that specially weaves ties. And I said, look, I know you do ties, but I'm trying to get a lining done. Is there possibly you can help? So they said, yes, send us photographs. I sent them a photograph, and they phoned back and said, yeah, okay. And I was ready for we can do anything you want, except that one. So they phoned back and they said, yeah, okay, how many meters? So, right, so we're looking good now. So if I just show you the inside of the coat, if you can see that lining. Could you take it around, just show people? And just walk around there. So that's what they produced for me. And it was at the point when I was able to get that lining done, I thought, that's it. Now I can get the rest of it done because I know where to get my tartan done. I've already got my 6 solid colours. I just need to really just hash out how I'm going to get a hand weaver. But that wasn't too much of a problem. I found a hand weaver. He was quite keen on the idea. In the UK, when you talk Doctor Who, people were like, their eyes light up. So when I showed this guy what I was actually trying to do, he was quite excited by it, and he was quite willing to help out. In fact, when it came to the woven back, I gave him flat scans of the original coat, and he was looking at it, and he said, okay, look, I can't find these yarns in these colours. I can find these yarns in plain colours. So what he did, there's about 6 or 8 colours in there. He hand dyed every single yarn to the right colour, and then he hand wove it. And he could only weave like a narrow panel like this. The width is only wide enough to take 1 panel of the back. And the backs are like done 2 together like that so that it doesn't waste any fabric. So then we were good to go. But how to actually, if you're interested, I've got a little presentation here about how I actually put the lining together. You can see here, this is my work in Photoshop, where what I've done is I've scanned the fabric of the coat. Because the original coat, it's all in little pieces, I had to like work out where the pattern repeat was and work out how big the pattern repeat was. And the pattern repeat on this fabric is about 8 inches square. It's quite a large pattern repeat area. And I then reduced it down, there you can see I was working out the exact area. I then reduced it to grayscale because it's got like 3 layers of colour. There's like a solid black, there's like a mid colour, and there's the pure graduated, the reds and purples and stuff that you saw on the coat going through. And I then produced that, which is just reducing the pattern to black, white and grey. And they put that into their computer system, do their magic, and that's what we ended up with. Now, when it comes to assembling the coat, you can see here, these are the 3 main sections of the coat that I put together. And what we're looking at is, it's the seam there between the green and the purple. That's the one that's folded, the seam allowances are all folded back that way. Now, a lot of frock coat patterns, they tell you to put the back together and these upper panels together and then hang the skirt off of it. But what I did was, you can see I've assembled the skirt to the underarm in one piece, and then you sew that curved arch along the back straight down to the hem. And by doing that, it makes the back a lot more stable, the way it actually goes together. Wow. Does sound like it, doesn't it?
We're all as excited as just being black.
Yeah. Wow. Anyway, so then we got it to the finished result. Now, if I've got just enough time, I brought along, which if you can have a look at afterwards. This is a coat that I'm working on at the moment, where I've deliberately half finished the coat, so you can see what's actually going on inside, how the coat's actually made. Now, we talked about that roll line that I liked, going right down to the hem. And if you look at the way I've made this, if I just pull this back and then I just let it go, see why that just pops straight back into the same position? It's not, it just likes to fold at that particular point. What we've got here on the inside, there's a line of linen tape which I've stitched to this is horsehair interface. This isn't actually attached or fused to the front of the coat, it's just laid in flat, and these bits of white stitching are just tacked in place just so that it doesn't move whilst I'm making the coat. And then I've just done a little tiny little prick stitch all the way down, which if you come up and have a close look, you can just see the little dimples of the stitches on the front there. And then when you press that, that is exactly where that coat wants to fold now. It won't fold any other way. And when I did the Shetland tweed and the Donegal, that was where I put that line of stitching. And when it comes to the collar, if you can just see these green stitches across here, it's called pad stitching. And again, on here, you can see it going down the front. And instead of fusing interfacing to the collar or lapel, what I've done is I've just laid the two layers together, because the horsehair needs to go a little bit further round because it's going on the outside of the fold, and the tartan's going a little bit shorter on the inside. So you lay them over so they lay flat together how you want them to lay, and then you hand stitch those bits together. So you're not doing it on a machine, because when you do stitching on a machine, it stresses things. And where you've got the feed dog underneath, pulling the fabric underneath, it will pull the fabric on the underside quicker than it will pull the fabric that's going on the top. Have you ever been stitching a seam together, you've got two bits of fabric that are the same length, and when you get to the end, suddenly they're not the same length anymore? And it's always the one on the bottom, it should always be the one on the bottom that's gone short, because the feed dog's been pulling that quicker, because it's then only between that low fabric and the top fabric that's pulling the top one. So doing it on a machine will always stress things. So hand stitching these little critical bits makes the difference. And when I make this collar, I'm using what's called collar canvas. It's really stiff canvas, which I've cut on the bias to make the collar. And the checked collar part it's just got a stabilising interface on the back, nothing really any serious. If it was a thicker fabric, I wouldn't use anything at all. And that is just a skin. The collar on top is just a skin over the top of this piece, which is doing all the structure. That's the bit that's supporting all the coat and actually making it do its thing. It's a bit irritating when it comes to doing the hem on this, because you have to, I stitch up the hem along there, but you obviously need to use a colour which won't get shown. So when you're stitching this, you've got to keep changing your thread colour. You've got to do just use a little bit of red for there, then you've got to change your colour to purple, and if you've got the other side which is green, you keep doing that as well. It's absolute nightmare. But at the end of this, you should feel free to come up and have a little look and see what we've done. Sorry, yeah.
I was just wondering how far up your ribbon, the stabilizing thing along the fold, how far up does that go? Does it go all the way around?
It goes, I take it right up to the top of that piece of fabric there, and that is the roll line. If you look, can you see where the tape is? And then that's matching up with the roll line on the collar. Yeah? So that those two are becoming the same one line, which you should have drawn on your pattern. You've marked the line of where you're going to do your collar or your lapel roll line. You always mark it on, and then that will give you that line. So getting those two to line up, that makes the whole thing work. Okay, but it just basically goes up there, and when I'm assembling the rest of it, it just gets lost amongst all the rest of what's going on. It doesn't necessarily need to be anchored or anything like that. It just sort of disappears up into the top. But yeah, when I started doing hand tailoring, I thought, oh, this is going to take forever. What's the point of doing this? When you start doing it, I find there's no other way to do it. It makes all the difference, and it's particularly around the collar and the lapel that it makes a jacket hang and sit right, and get a collar that you can control. Sometimes you end up with you're making a collar and the collar controls you because it doesn't want to go in right. But I find if I do it this way, I then control the collar. And the last thing I want to just say, when you make when you make a collar. If you have a seam along here, seams, as I said, will have a stress on them, and sometimes you end up with the collar point curling up. What I've done is the edge of the collar just literally folds round, and I just hand stitch it down. Can you see that? That little bit there? It's just folded round from the front to the back. And it's just hand stitched in place. Because when you hand stitch stuff, as I said, you're not putting any stress on the fabric. You're not pulling things one way or the other. So it means that point will be nice, will sit nice. And the other thing that I like about doing it that way, when a jacket is on someone, you're looking slightly up at the collar. The collar's going away from you. And if there was a seam there, you'd be able to see it. But by folding it round, you don't see it. And it makes the collar look thinner. When you can see 2 layers of fabric, it looks thicker. It's a trick. It's like the edge of the iPad. The edge of the iPad, it's thick in the middle and it goes out thin at the edge. So you look at the iPad and you think it's a lot thinner than it really is, but it's not. It's actually quite thick, but it goes out thin around the edges, and that is the same way I do it on there. Okay, well that's, I think, pretty much covers everything that I wanted to say. So thank you so much for coming along. Oh, Scott, yeah, last question.
What type of iron do you use?
What type of iron do I use? Well, I always used to use a sort of ordinary sort of normal Tefal iron until I discovered a steam generating iron. And that is the only thing I use now. I've got a proper professional 2-litre steam generating iron. And they're expensive. I mean, they're, I guess, $400, I guess, something like that. They're not cheap, but they are the best ever. You know the way sometimes you get an iron, you put it on some interface, it just disappears into nothing. It gets burnt onto the underside of your iron. You've got to put something over the top of muslin, and then when you put the muslin over the top, you can't see what you're ironing. My steam iron, I can iron directly onto interface without it burning. So you get the heat, but you don't get the burning. It's amazing. So yeah, if you can get yourself a steam generating iron, that's another thing that's worth investing in. Okay, any other questions? Just to wrap up, yes, sir?
A lot of old tailoring books say a lot about pressing versus ironing. Do you find that it makes nearly the same difference that these books try to say? Because I mean, I assume fabric is constructed differently than it used to be woven.
Yeah.
So it was like you had to put it on, take it off. You never moved the iron in conjunction with the fabric. Do you find that makes a difference today?
Difficult. I mean, I use a steam generating iron, so I mean, I'm using an iron as an iron. But yeah, I mean, pressing a garment properly as you're going along does make an enormous difference. I've seen people make garments where they've done a good job of making it, but they've obviously hate doing ironing, and they never seem to press a seam, and you end up with this thing that's all sort of bulges around, all coming out of the seams. You really need to press things as you go along, and if you're doing a velvet, get yourself a needle board.
A what?
Needle board. If you imagine like the old bed of nails, but it's miniaturized. And what it does is you lay it down on your ironing board. You put your velvet nap side down, and then you can press as hard as you want, because these needles support the backing of the fabric, and the nap of the velvet is going down in between the needles, and it doesn't get pressed and damaged and crushed. And where sometimes you press and you get the seam allowance showing through, yeah. You get yourself a needle board. I mean, I paid about £100 for my one, but I spent about $150. But my God, it was worth it. If you're going to do anything in velvet, do it. Last question? No?
Any tips for women's?
That's another thing. Yeah, people will specialize. I specialize in men's tailoring. So to be honest, I really don't have any tips on that. And I've done a couple of things for women. In fact, this lady just walked in the back there who's wearing a Romana pink frock coat. I'm making one of those at the moment, and it's a learning curve. There's always things that you come along with, and you always push yourself. Push yourself. Don't just carry on doing the same old thing. Go to something else. Always sort of push yourself a bit further. Okay, guys, thank you very much for coming along. Hope you enjoyed it.